Hello and welcome to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and you're watching live on PhillyCam TV, WPPM FM, a 106.5 FM in Philadelphia, and live on Facebook on YouTube. On today's show, we are going to be featuring organizers from the Movement for Black Lives, the movement to end mass incarceration, and also an emerging movement to get police out of schools. We'll be featuring folks from the Black Philly Radical Collective, Philadelphia Student Union, and the Abolitionist Law Center. Stay tuned for all that and more on this edition of the People Power Lunch Hour Show. We'll be Hello and welcome to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we are going to be having a conversation today about the movement for Black Lives and the recent uprisings happening across the country, calling for an end to policing and mass incarceration. Today, I'm joined by the show by several guests, but my first guest is Robert Saleem Holbrook. Oh, and we have Saudia Durrant, and I see YahNé Ndgo is also able to make it. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start with Saleem because he got here first. Saleem is with the Abolitionist Law Center, and their organization is a public interest law firm inspired by the struggle of political and politicized prisoners and organized for the purpose of abolishing class and race-based mass incarceration in the United States. They litigate on behalf of people whose human rights have been violated in prison, educates the general public about the evils of mass incarceration, and works to develop a mass movement against the American punishment system by building alliances and nurturing solidarity across social divisions. Saleem is a director of community organizing, and he's also the co-founder of the Human Rights Coalition, an organization with chapters in Philly and Pittsburgh that's composed of family members of prisoners, which advocates on behalf of the civil and human rights of prisoners. Welcome to the show, Saleem.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd also like to welcome to the show Saudia Durrant. Saudia is part of the Philadelphia Student Union. She's an organizer and media coordinator, and they exist to build the power of young people to demand a high-quality education in the Philadelphia public school system. They're a youth-centered organization, and they work to make positive changes in the short term by learning how to organize to build power. Welcome to the show, Saudia.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Definitely excited to be on this platform today.
Thank you for joining us. And we also have YahNé Ndgo. And YahNé is with the Black Philly Radical Collective and Black Lives Matter Philly. She's a consultant, organizer, and she does a lot of work here in Philly and all over the U.S. Welcome to the show, YahNé.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here and in conversation with all of you. And I also want to mention I also organize with the Black Alliance for Peace.
Thank you. All right, so I just want to go around by letting you talk about a little bit of the work that you do in your respective organizations. And it's especially important in this conversation that we're having now about defunding or abolishing the police and ending mass incarceration, and with Saudia's work, removing police from schools. YahNé, let's start with you. You've been out there in the streets, educating people, letting people know what people of color, but especially Black people in West Philly, Southwest Philly, and North Philadelphia have been experiencing at the hands of the police. Talk a little bit about the formation of the Black Philly Radical Collective in response to all of the uprisings that's been occurring across the country?
Sure. The collective was formulated rather organically. So there was the initiation of the rebellion, and of course, as organizers, we recognized that it was really important to shift or use or empower the mobilizing with more strategic organizing, and so there were several of us from a few different organizations that came together in order to draft a set of demands that would address the particular concern that was on the forefront of people's minds at this moment. So of course we have a variety and a range of concerns and issues that need to be addressed in our communities, our Black communities, and our Indigenous and Latino communities, poor working class communities, across the cities and across the nation. That at this moment, there's a focus on the issue of state-based violence against the Black community. And so we wanted to take that and capture this moment, and we put together demands that focus on that specifically. As a result of that, those of us who came together and organized and developed those demands, which we did, like I said, very collectively, went to shift from that to working together in order to engage the larger community around those demands and to be able to strategize how we move forward in order to see those demands met. And in the process, we recognized that we were becoming a collective, and we decided to begin to formalize that. We actually, because of the fact that this was, as they say, we built that plane while it was flying, it's still much of it as it relates to the processes and of how this collective was going to be looking and operating are still in process, as it also relates to how we connect with others who are aligned with us on these issues, as it relates to what we will be focusing on beyond any issues as it relates to the state-based violence or the police and carceral systems application or manifestation of state-based violence, because we do absolutely recognize that state-based violence extends beyond policing. It extends beyond these carceral systems. It is also things like hunger that is unnecessary in a wealthy nation, like the reality that we have homeless encampments, people who are encamped and having to sleep in tents while we've got empty buildings, while we have children who are having to be educated in buildings that are that are unhealthy and that have safety hazards. There are lots of ways that state-based violence shows up. So we're still working to figure out how we want to organize beyond that. That initial focus on the police iteration and the carceral systems iteration of state-based violence. So that's how we formed and how we've been operating, and we are still looking forward to focusing primarily on engaging our community around these demands, around how we facilitate them, how we establish a self-determined community where we drive what happens in our community. We decide what's best for our community. We implement the programs that are best for our community, and we do that collectively. So one last thing I want to say is that it's very important that we do not repeat the ways that quite often people engage with elected officials, and those individuals decide that they have the autonomy and the authority to make all the decisions on the behalf of a community. So we have our ideas, we have our beliefs about what is right, and we really recognize the importance of us connecting with the community in order to talk these things out and to imagine what is possible for us as a collective.
Thank you, YahNé. And we're going to get into the demands a little bit later in the show and also clarify some misconceptions that have been circulating in the media about this movement. But first, I want to welcome to the show Asantewaa Nkrumah-Ture. And Asantewaa is also an organizer here in Philly and with the Green Party and the Black Philly Radical Collective and many other organizations. Feel free to cite any other affiliations. Welcome to the show.
Yes, good afternoon, Vanessa, and to all my comrades there. My name is Asantewaa Nkrumah-Ture. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm an active and dues-paying member of the Green Party of Philadelphia, Black Alliance for Peace, the Philadelphia Tenants Union, and the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign.
That's right. And Asantewaa is another one I always see out there at meetings, in the streets, organizing. So I'm really glad to have you here. Talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with those various organizations in response to the uprisings that have been happening and trying to organize people to build power and fight back against state violence.
Sure, thank you. Well, I didn't participate in the actual I did participate in the organizing of a couple of these protests here in Philadelphia. The one that happened on June the 1st, and another one that happened on June 1st and July 1st, excuse me. I participated in some planning meetings. What I would just say is that overall, with the intensity of the protests here in Philadelphia and across the country, it's been a very beautiful and inspiring sight. A lot of young people who for the first time in their lives have actually protested. And what I find the most encouraging is for many young people, particularly young whites, they are learning more about the racist and imperialist and genocidal history of this country from attending a protest than they ever learned in their schools. I had, brief conversations with many people over the course of these protests, and we're chatting about what they think about their future, things like that. And they're realizing they have been lied to. And I don't want to tell too much about my age, but young people had similar conversations back in the day during the Vietnam War. People were in the streets and they were protesting the war. And they learned that, again, things they learned in school were not true. They were lied to. So I take great pleasure in seeing all these taking down of statues and monuments and so forth of racist, genocidal people, white people. And what people are learning, again, is we've been lied to in history in our schools. We've been lied to in such a way that we think there's nothing else to do better. And young people are seeing that, they can do better. We can do better. We should have better. Young people are now realizing with the virus and unemployment and pretty much a recession right now that they are not guaranteed a good future with or without a college education. They are not guaranteed a job. So I think all these things are coming together and really motivating people for these protests. And I'm very happy to see that. And I want to encourage, the young people to participate and organize in these protests and do not be distracted by politicians, whether they be Democrats or Republicans.
Thank you for that, Asantewaa. So speaking of young people, we're going to go to Saudia, who has been working with youth. And typically, a lot of the organizing you've been doing has been directly about education and about their experience in schools. And since the uprisings happened, y'all have shifted into a very specific issue. Talk a little bit about that work and then the campaign that you have to end police in schools.
Yeah. Hey, so yeah, it's definitely been a crazy time in 2020, especially for our young people. Before the pandemic, our students had already been talking about, how do we get more resources and more fundings in our schools? Asbestos was a big issue at the top of this year. So many schools were closed temporarily and possibly permanently because of the asbestos that's been discovered in a lot of buildings where young people are expected to learn or to thrive. Going into the pandemic, our students had already been thinking about and imagining what does it mean to divest from areas within the school budget that shouldn't be top tier priorities, particularly policing. Last year, there was about $28 million spent on school policing, and this year we saw a $1 million increase roughly that now shifted to about 30 million. So once we got into this pandemic, of course, obviously we shifted to thinking about how do young people get access to computers? How do young people have access to internet, free access to internet? How do young people stay informed and also still have space to talk about the struggle of digital learning? And then when we saw everything that unfolded, right, with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and knowing that these names add to this infinite list of people that we should not have lost through state-sponsored violence, we saw that as a clear opportunity, especially with how folks are being so rapidly politicized in this moment, to think about what does it look like in America for Black and brown marginalized people? What does it look like globally? We saw a lot of our partners, right, throughout the country, from Oakland to Denver to Florida to New York, who are all launching police-free schools. And we had already been thinking about, you know, how do we end the school to prison pipeline? And what we arrived at in seeing these uprisings is that there is no reformative process that will end systemic racism and systemic injustices, right? That policing and the history of it has fundamentally been rooted in terrorizing Black and brown people. It's been used to undermine movements that young people have led from the civil rights, right, to the 70s to now. And for us, it's really about saying, like, this is the time for abolition. You know, why continue trying to fix something year after year, trying to give more money to something year after year that still continues to traumatize and murder innocent people? So for us, you know, we see a deep correlation between the resources that young people don't have to make them feel understood, to make them feel loved and trusted and nurtured. Things like counselors, nurses, restorative justice practitioners, conflict de-escalators, right? Those are the areas that we always see an excuse for why we can't fund this or why there isn't enough money. But we never see that argument for policing. So now we're saying we're committed to reprioritizing these funds and to shifting the culture of schools, really, right? Like shifting the culture of constantly penalizing students for any little mistake, but then justifying keeping an officer on the force who has a record of harming people or killing people. We've seen this at assaults at Benjamin Franklin High School when one of our members was assaulted by a cop when he tried to get access to the bathroom. We saw it at Salas Cohen Elementary, where an 8-year-old child was dragged out of his classroom by a school cop and then assaulted in a nearby bathroom. Their family weren't even told that the complaint system that we won for police was put in place. They were told, oh, you know, this was just a mistake. And for us, you know, it's clear that there needs to be new policies and new practices to transform education. And we believe through having police-free schools that that'll happen.
Thank you for that very thorough description of the connection between all of these things. And that's really the goal of the show is, you know, it's not just about police violence, but this whole system of oppression, right, that has so many tentacles and reaches our communities in various ways. That being said, I'd like to now go to Saleem because people are dying right now who are behind bars due to COVID-19 and not being able to keep people who are in prisons safe. They're also dying in our detention centers and our jails. And it's really a crisis of epic proportions that's not being talked about. So it's one thing when we talk about people who are affected by arrests and racial profiling and the murders of Black people by police. But there's many people who go on to die in prison. There are people who are political prisoners right now sitting behind bars that shouldn't be. And if we want to talk about divestment and saving money and reallocating resources, we could save a whole heck of a lot of money if we close prisons. So Saleem, talk a little bit about your work. You're also involved in the Black Philly Radical Collective and do a lot of work here locally.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly right. Decarceration and abolition will certainly free up resources that our communities definitely need to help deal with intracommunal violence and violence prevention. For us, the work right now in terms of abolition is also making sure that we connect state violence happening out here on the streets at whatever level it is, whether it's policing, housing, with what's going on the inside. And an example of that connection is that right now in this moment where the entire country is at an uprising against an officer from Minneapolis, Minnesota, killing an unarmed black man, and us listening to his last words, "I can't breathe, I'm gonna die." In November of last year, a prisoner at SCI Mahanoy in Pennsylvania was tear gassed to death en route to the solitary confinement holding cell after he defended himself in a fight on the walkway. After he was handcuffed, the COs continued to use OC spray bursts on him. And when they dragged him to his feet, he collapsed and said, "I can't breathe." As they were dragging him to the restricted housing unit, solitary confinement, he fell out. He kept falling. He kept telling them, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." He got up into the holding cell and he went into cardiac arrest and died. And those were his last words, "I can't breathe." In 2012, a prisoner I know named John J. Rock Carter, he was sentenced to life without parole at the age of 16. At SCI Rockview, the guards denied him a food tray. And in retaliation for that, he barricaded his cell and was like, "I want my tray, I want to eat a meal." He was pepper sprayed to death in his cell. The guards unleashed so much pepper spray in that cell, they used multiple canisters, and not only was his cell impacted, but the entire range, prisoners had to put their heads in the toilet and flush the toilets because they couldn't breathe. To escape the pepper spray, he climbed into his mattress and he suffocated. He died. They pulled him out the cell. He was dead. They tried to, some medics came up, you know, and pronounced him dead on the scene. His last words were, "I can't breathe." This was right around the time of Eric Garner. So for us, it's very important that we connect state violence on the inside, where you are disappeared and where your cries of "I can't breathe" are not heard or covered up, right? Because in those cases, the coroner listed both of those deaths as pretty much justifiable homicide. Now, we're representing the family of Tyrone Briggs, the prisoner who was killed at SCI Mahanoy. So for us, state violence just doesn't happen on the streets. It happens inside of prisons. It impacts everyday lives of Black people and brown people in this country, when we have to walk around with the anxiety knowing that any encounter we have with law enforcement could be our last. So that's some of the areas that our work has taken in. And then in terms of our communities, what our communities need right now at this moment, we don't need more police. We don't need more prisons. We certainly don't need police in school. We need a complete divestment in policing and a substantive investment in the people and advocates and grassroots movements that are doing work in our communities to address intracommunal violence, right? I don't say Black on Black violence because there's no such thing as Black on Black violence. Black people shouldn't be the only, we are burdened with enough in this world. We should not be the only people on the planet burdened with the term Black on Black violence whenever we have intracommunal harm. Oppressed communities all over the world have the highest rates of intracommunal violence, but also more white people kill or harm other white people. The same thing with Black people, with Latinx people, right? This is statistically just a fact. Unfortunately, this is weaponized against movements like Black Lives Matter and activists who are out on the streets talking about police accountability. So in order for us to diminish the reliance on police and ultimately get rid of it, we're going to need a massive reinvestment in our community. I think that's where the defund police movement has started to raise some important issues, some contradictions. And for us, we're abolitionists, right? defunding police for us is just one step. We want a complete alternative structure of community safety for our neighborhoods. That does not involve policing. Police shouldn't be responding to domestic disputes. Police shouldn't be responding to people who suffer from mental health problems. Police shouldn't be responding to people who suffer from trauma. Police shouldn't be responding to incidents in schools. So for us, we would like to see an investment in grassroots communities, doing intracommunal harm, working with youth, working with women, working with domestic abuse programs, so that we don't have to rely on police. Because police don't make us safer. Because if policing made our community safer, the communities that are most policed, that are over-policed, also have the highest rates of harm. So that shows us that policing does not make us safer.
Yeah, and I just want to note something that has come up recently as a result of the high number of murders that have been happening in Philly in the last couple of weeks, that Philadelphia has one of the lowest rates of solved homicides. So it has about 2 years ago, I think they did a statistic, it was 37% of homicides were solved, which means that 63% are unsolved. And we also know about untested rape kits and unsolved sexual assaults. So a legitimate question is, what are the police actually doing if they're not solving the worst crimes that are out there? So I think it's a question of what makes us feel safer? What is public safety? And I think that means different things in different communities. We're going to take a short break right now. We have some information we want to show you in a PSA, but when we come back, we'll have more with our panel, and we'll talk more about the demands that we would like to speak to our legislators about and other people in power that are positioned to make change in our communities. We'll be right back. You're listening to the People Power Lunch Hour show on Philly Cam TV and WPPM Community Radio. Welcome back to the show. This is the People Power Lunch Hour show. We are talking about abolishing systems of oppression and some of the demands that are being put forth by grassroots movements here in Philadelphia and all across the country that are calling for an abolition to police in schools, abolition of prisons, and abolition of state violence. I have here a really great panel of organizers and people doing excellent work in our communities. Robert Saleem Holbrook, Saudia Durrant, Asantewaa Nkrumah-Ture, and YahNé Ndgo. Welcome back to the show. So right now, I want to talk about specific ways we can make change. We had a conversation with one of the city council members, Jamie Gauthier, who said that she supported defunding the police and the idea of it, but was unclear of a specific plan or roadmap to get there. So this is the point where we'd like to break it down for our politicians and let them know what are some of the specific steps that they can take in order to start chipping away at that. The Black Philly Radical Collective had a press conference a week and a half ago outside of Independence Hall, and they mentioned the numerous ways that we can defund police and put some of these things into action. So YahNé, I'd like to start with you. You don't have to go through every single demand. You can if you want, but what are some of the top things that we're calling for the city to do? Because right now, we were able to prevent an increase in the police budget, but the headlines were rather incorrect. The police were not actually defunded. Their funding was not actually reduced. Money was moved around into different pots, but they are actually at pretty much the same levels of last year, which means no significant change has really happened.
Right. So, and that's actually what the first demand is speaking to. So first, I want to say that this document we see this as a working document. So we have a particular set of goals in mind, and we have a vision, and these demands represent and reflect that vision. And as things happen in the community that call for it, some aspects of the language and the demands may be adjusted in order to ensure that the vision is protected and that the vision is centered. So one of the first demand is the authentic defunding of the police budget. So originally that demand spoke about not increasing the not voting against the increase to the budget as has been done. But when they voted against, when they presented that they were not going to increase the police budget, as you're mentioning, they also articulated that they had dropped the police budget by $33 million. And as you mentioned, that was not true. They actually shifted the funds and moved certain departments out of the police's budget into other line items, so that there was exactly the same budget, or pretty exactly the same budget. And so we're demanding an authentic defunding of the police budget, and for those funds to be used to address the issues of asbestos and lead paint that are in our schools, as mentioned by Saudia. We cannot have our children having to breathe in these kind of environmental toxins in the spaces that they spend the majority of their day every week for the majority of the year. And the school district has expressed that this would be estimated to cost about $25 million a year. Now, we had a meeting with the administration, the city's administration, and they did talk quite a bit about the things that they have done as it relates to the schools and ways that they have worked to improve the environments in the schools. And while we appreciate that, the reality is that our children are still breathing toxic air. Our children are still being harassed by police. The education, there's still not natural play environments in many of the schools, and particularly in the schools that are in poorer and Black communities. There's a lack of educational opportunities around things like the arts and sports programming, and so it's absolutely not sufficient. And we are not interested in comparing what the Philadelphia schools look like today to what they looked like a year ago or 2 years ago, because that was still absolutely not sufficient. We can see what the schools can look like. We can see what the schools can look like when we look at certain public schools in the city of Philadelphia. Magnet public schools in wealthy environments. They have playgrounds, they have healthy environments, they have arts programming, and they do not have policing. And so it's not a necessity in these environments. And so we are suggesting and we are demanding that every child in education has a safe and full, positive educational experience and educational opportunity, regardless of what part of the city they're in, regardless of whether or not their community has more white people, because there are stats that show that there is more, every time the number of Black students in a school increases by 10%, there's a direct decrease in the amount of funds that goes to every child. And this is across the entire nation. And this is also reflected here in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia. And so until the schools are actually equitable to what other children are receiving, it's not good enough. And so we still want those funds to be reallocated to our Philadelphia school district. The second demand is the immediate cease of the criminalization of Black resistance. And so we know that this rebellion that people are engaged in is righteous and necessary, and it is in response to violence that has been perpetuated against our communities in perpetuity since the beginning, actually, of the beginning of this nation. And so when people are hitting back, when they're not hitting first, we weren't hitting first. Our community is hitting back. When people are hitting back, that is their right, and it is also their responsibility, and it is not to be criminalized. And so there are hundreds of individuals who have been targeted, have been arrested, and who are waiting to see what kind of charges are laid against them. There are individuals who have faced tear gassing, have faced rubber bullets, have been hit and permanently harmed by the aggressive tactics of the police. People have had tanks rolling through their neighborhoods, have been terrorized because of their responding to the responsibility of standing up for their human rights. And we demand that activities immediately cease, and that further that any charges against anybody who has been protesting be dropped, and that there's an examination of the difference in how these white vigilantes who have been exacting violence have been responded to by police in comparison to, and they have been exacting violence against people, and how that is being responded to in comparison to how the people who have been responded to by police in these Black and brown communities, and who have been responding in support of Black and brown communities, and who have been so-called violent against property. And the third demand is the immediate and permanent removal of all symbols of state violence. And so, yes, it is true that the city has removed the Rizzo statue. It is also, we are demanding that statue not only be removed, but also be publicly destroyed, because we want to see that it is actually done. And one of the arguments that the current administration has is that they did not agree with the Rizzo statue being there, and that they do not want it to ever be replaced. And while that may be absolutely true, that statue can easily be replaced by another administration. They are not here in perpetuity. And so the only way that we can be guaranteed that statue is never replaced is if it is destroyed. And that is the same. The same goes for that Columbus statue that right now is boarded up, and to that good sign, that sign to Mayor Wilson Goode, to former Mayor Wilson Goode, who presided over the bombing of civilians in Philadelphia because they were standing up against police terror and standing up for the rights of all humans and living creatures. And so to have a street sign there is an insult to the community, is an insult to human rights, and it is an insult to the very specific family, the Move family, who has suffered as a result of the way that Mayor Goode presided over the city during that time. And so we are demanding that those be removed, and that there is also legislation introduced that ensures that there will be no further symbols of state violence allowed in the city. And those are the first 3 demands of the 13 demands. And those 3 demands are demands that we expect to be met before we really have any engagements with the elected officials. It is a show of good faith for us, because we do not feel that we have the ability to trust the elected officials to do what it is that they say they're going to do, and not to waste our time when we could be actually organizing with our community, engaging with our community, and building self-determinate processes within our community. So for us to shift any of our time from that work that's really core and important to us to engaging with elected officials around moving this process forward, we need a show of faith that they are going to actually do things that are productive with us. And meeting those first 3 demands is the way that we see that faith being able to begin to be established. And then we can go through the process of working through everything else. One last thing that I'll say is that as it relates to how to meet the demands to abolish the police, because one of the things that is moved in to abolish the prison system and its carceral systems, because that is a theme throughout the demands that you will see, which include also the removal, the release of our vulnerable prisoners and our political prisoners, which is extremely important, in particular when we have 2 political prisoners who are in dire health and need to be released and be able to be with the family and the community and get the health care that they need. But the primary focus for meeting these demands is to recognize the power of the community. We don't need elected officials to find the solutions. What we need is for elected officials to get out of the way of the communities and the community's ability to actually activate the solutions that we already know, we already have been exploring, and to come together to put together programs that will keep our communities safe and healthy and cared for with an authentic interest and desire to do that.
The show always shows that the community has all the solutions and proposals. If they would just listen to community members and put these ideas into practice, we could make a lot more progress. Saleem, I wanted to talk to you some of these other demands, which are all related, which is the demand to end all carceral systems, the immediate permanent release of Mumia Abu-Jamal, Major Tillery, Arthur Setawayo Johnson, Russell Maroon Shoatz, Omar Askia, Joseph Jojo Bowen, and all Black political prisoners, and the immediate release of all vulnerable individuals in prison.
Yes. Thank you, YahNé, too, for raising up the lives and voices of our political prisoners on the inside. The reason why we felt it was mandatory that we center political prisoners in this moment is because 50 years ago, political prisoners who are in prison today responded to the call for police accountability and responded to police brutality in the city of Philadelphia, and they're still in prison to this day. For us, that's very important because we cannot dismiss them or leave them out of this conversation because they sacrificed their lives for it. And let's set the context for this. We celebrated as we saw the statue of Rizzo come down in Philadelphia because we knew that statue represented racism, discrimination, homophobia. That statue represented someone who used the police as a way to strong arm and oppress communities of color in Philadelphia, particularly the Black community. The political prisoners in prison today, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Russell Maroon Shoatz, Fred Muhammad Burton, they were fighting Rizzo when he was alive. They responded to Rizzo's not threat, but actual use of the Philadelphia Police Department to shut down and stamp out civil dissent within Philadelphia. And they've been in prison for over close to 50 years now. We brought down that statue of Rizzo. We now have to bring home his victims who are still in prison. And so that's why it's important for us, because they put it all on the line for this moment that we're in. A young Mumia Abu-Jamal, if you read his book, We Want Freedom, says that when he was 15 years old, it was Frank Rizzo's police department that literally kicked him into the Black Panther Party when he was at a protest at Benjamin Franklin High School. And that protest was revolving around public education in Philadelphia in the civil rights moment. And Rizzo unleashed the police on students and they beat him. And Mumia was one of those students that was beaten. And he said that pushed him into the Black Panther Party because he wanted to fight for social justice. Who's going to fight for them today? It should be us fighting for them today. And we want to make that connection because when we're talking about defunding police, if we're talking about police abolition, if we're talking about intracommunal harm, political prisoners should be central to that conversation. It shouldn't be left out of it. And then when we talk about vulnerable populations in prison, especially with COVID, because let's understand, COVID is not gone. It is still here. It is still impacting our communities at a higher rate than white communities. We have to take this seriously. But on the inside, people on the inside can't social distance. And seniors on the inside are incredibly vulnerable to this. Pennsylvania has lost, I think, 10 prisoners to COVID. I knew 2 of the prisoners who personally died. One of them was 71 years old. 2 of them were in their 70s, and they died of COVID-related complications. They had both been in prison for over 40 years, but they were denied the opportunity release because of their offenses, because they had violent offenses. However, people who are 70 years old, people who are in their 60s do not constitute a threat to our communities. In fact, statistically, they are the least likely group to reoffend, and they are the group that poses the least risk to our community. So they should be freed. There's no reason why someone should be 65 and older and still in prison today. So, you know, we're advocating for their release. And when we look at what's going on now in between the state's response to COVID, and not the state of Pennsylvania, I'm talking about the United States response to COVID. And when we look at what's going on with the uprising against policing, it's never been more apparent in my lifetime that we live in a failed state. And what I mean by that is you see it right in front of you, that this is a failed state, a failed society we live in. And the only way for us to push back and create change that's going to give us breathing space is if we fight and organize and mobilize against it.
Thank you for that. Asantewaa, I want to make the connection between white supremacy and being anti-capitalist, because the poverty in our communities is both racist and connected to capitalist policies. And you have done a lot of work with the Poor People's Campaign and other movements to address poverty in our communities. One of the demands is to fund communities, not cops. And one of the last demands is to a demand for reparative economic justice for the aforementioned harms to Black communities. Can you talk more about that as well?
I'm a member of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. One of our more prominent members is Sherry Hankala. They've been doing this work for more than 30 years. And it's a grassroots movement of poor and working class people, because we know that a poor people's movement must be led, organized, and financed by poor people themselves, not the Democratic Party, not the nonprofit industrial complex, and not foundations or celebrities. So first, let me put that out there. But the connection to capitalism and racism, you know, all these things are interconnected. They have a dialectical or intersectional relationship. Capitalism is just one of greed. If you recall what Malcolm X said, you know, capitalism is a blood-sucking system. And racism and sexism and homophobia and all those things are interconnected. And they, if you will, complement and strengthen each other. What we see with the police are the strong arm of the capitalist system. And they do horrific things to defend property relations, to defend the rich, protect the rich, the interests of the rich, etc. So that's what I really like about these protests. They're taking on a much more openly anti-capitalist, socialist perspective. More and more of these young people are reading about capitalism, reading about socialism, etc. And that's a very good thing, because as I have been told by many young people, they're learning things in these protests that they don't learn in school, nor do they learn from their parents or their places of worship. That's a very good thing. So we're hoping as these things go forward, particularly with the elections coming up this fall, that this type of momentum continues. I would just say that a challenge to the capitalist system with these protests is to defund the police, we must have community control of the police. And that's a distinction that must be clearly made. Community control of the police, so the community can determine this is about qualified immunity, when police pretty much get away with whatever they do, no matter who they kill, who they murder, who they maim, who they rape, etc. That can be dealt with community control of the police. Oversight boards that have hiring and firing power, subpoena power, etc. All these things, if we organize, we can find out how to best do this. And that's what this system is afraid of. The people, not only in the streets, but organized in a way that they can bring about the change that we want for our communities. If you look at also some of our city officials, it's very telling. Mayor Kinney nor Police Commissioner Outlaw apologized to West Philadelphia. They apologized for what happened on the 676, and rightly so, because the protesters there were unnecessarily tear gassed. And a friend of mine's son has suffered some very adverse reactions to that tear gas. But there's been no official apology to the people of West Philadelphia. who were tear gas, pepper sprayed, rubber bullets, noise bangs, etc., all along 52nd Street between Arch and Baltimore Avenue. No apology from Mayor Kinney. There was a community speak out last Tuesday, June the 30th, regarding this matter, and a lot of people came out and said, you know, I was in my living room, I was on my porch, I got tear gas, I wasn't protesting, but there's been no apology to the residents of West Philadelphia. We organized ourselves and we can hold these people accountable. When we organize ourselves, this is where the change is going to come. And I think a good example of the organizing from the community speak out last Tuesday was 2 members of the city council came to that community speak out. It was held in Malcolm X Park. Council member Jen and Gertier, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce her name. They came to the community speak out, and the organizers of the community speak out did not allow them to speak, because as city council members, they did not do all that they could regarding this police budget. We need to organize ourselves to see who of these politicians receive any type of financial or political support from the Fraternal Order of Police. We should make it uncomfortable. We should make it unbearable to accept any support from the Fraternal Order of Police. If you run for office in Philadelphia, and if you receive any support from the Fraternal Order of Police, that should be seen as a kiss of death for your campaign. This is what we mean by organizing and really looking at these issues, doing our own research, not being swayed by photo ops along 52nd Street with certain people, etc. This is what we must do as we organize. So all of this is part of capitalism, because if we have all these needs in our city, in our communities, but you have entities in this city that do not pay their fair share of taxes, that needs to be looked at as well.
Thank you. And I just want to point out a couple things, which is not only did people who were organizing experience the tear gas and the pepper spray and the rubber bullets and other violence, but people sitting on their porches, people walking down the street, people in their backyards, children, they also were victims of this. And so that really needs to be said. The second thing is a point that YahNé clarified during the press conference, which is that people who were shopping or taking goods from stores were redistributing them to other poor people in the community. And that's something that had not been shown or highlighted by mainstream media. So that's another important point that I want to make. And the other thing is related to that, which is that there has been a really excessive fixation on people who have been taking goods, poor people taking goods, and not a narrative around the real looters, right? The corporations that took the bulk of the COVID-19 funds, and the corporations that get tax breaks, and the obscene amount of money that we're spending on our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so those are some counterpoints I want to bring into the conversation. But I want to take a very quick break to show our last PSA. And when we come back, we'll go to Saudia to talk about what a police-free school looks like. All right, welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour. We have just a few minutes left in the show. But before that, I want to give Saudia opportunity to talk about what a police-free school looks like. Some of the things mentioned on your website talk about how to be involved in things like de-escalation and restorative justice. Talk more about what are alternative strategies to deal with students who might be breaking the rules, for example.
Yeah, so I think for us, it's really about like the piece that was brought up around what does community control look like for our schools. We're demanding that the school district repurposes its current Office of School Safety that employs roughly around 350 school cops, and instead commits to employing community members and the same sort of skills to increase safety. I think for our young people, Police Free Schools is about making sure that the community is really in leadership, right, of what our schools look like. It means that our young people should be able to go into buildings that empowers them to trust their adults, empowers them to work through conflicts, empowers them to embody the skills that should really be prioritized for human development, right? And not just being trained on how to fill the status quo or to, do a lot of the capitalistic things that we're trained to do, which is just to create profit or to operate. For us, it's really about, how do we ensure that there are educators and adults who feel fully supported to step into conflicts, and aren't, pushed to call on police or to call on 911. For us, it's really just about imagining what doesn't exist. And I think part of the issue is that, for us, we have never seen a world without policing or without police violence. And I think this challenge is really about saying, like, look, it's time for us to stop investing in things that don't work and don't serve us. I think it's also about young people being able to have access to counselors and nurses. In the average school nationally, it's believed that one counselor should be enough for 250 students. I think really unbreaking a lot of those conditions that increase the need for policing or the severity of policing when there isn't enough adult staff and other roles is really critical. And I think it's about folks feeling like they're in an institution that is fully invested for art and creativity and imagination. Like, most students go into buildings that literally look like prisons from the outsides if they're not a magnet or a special admission school. And it looks like that inside the building as well. So for us, it's really about shifting away from policing, shifting away from criminalizing natural behaviors, not just in young people, but in humans in general. And just really uplifting that our schools are the first institutions that we get developed on how to interact and how to love and how to socialize. And that needs to be prioritized in order to transform the systems that we want to have transformed.
Thank you so much. If you want to learn more about their campaign, you can go to their website, which I believe is phillystudentunion.com. Thank you so much, Saudia Durrant. I also want to thank Saleem Holbrook with the Abolitionist Law Center and Human Rights Coalition and Black Philly Radical Collective. You can find more at abolitionistlawcenter.org. And I also want to thank Asantewaa for joining us. She's with the Green Party of Philadelphia, the Black Alliance for Peace, and also the Poor People's Campaign for Economic and Human Rights. And last but not least, YahNé Ndgo, thank you so much for joining us. She's with Black Lives Matter Philly. The website is BLM Philly, BlackAllianceForPeace.com, and Black Philly Radical Collective.com. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And please check out their websites, read the information, educate yourself on this, and go to a rally or protest and listen. If nothing else, listen to some of the speakers and what they have to say. And finally, I'll end this by saying Black Lives Matter. See, that's easy to say, right? Black Lives Matter. When Black Lives Matter, all lives will matter. We must be in solidarity with one another. We must Black and brown together, work together in this fight. It affects all of us. We're all a community. And this is something that is a lifelong struggle. So I am proud to know all of you. And I thank you so much for your knowledge and all of your work. You are listening to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. If you'd like to learn more about People Power, you can look at our website, phillycam.org, and our community radio station is WPPM 106.5 FM. You can find this episode and all of our episodes on our YouTube page at PhillyCam. Thank you so much for watching and listening.
Oh.